They thought it was a trap. That was the first thought Greta Hoffmann had when she saw the breakfast tray. It was early morning in the late winter of 1944, the kind of southern morning where the air already carried a soft warmth even before the sun cleared the trailing. The prisoner camp sat quiet under a pale sky somewhere in the American countryside, wooden barracks lined in neat rows across packed red dirt, the smell of pine drifting through the cool air. Greta walked with the other German women across the yard toward the mess hall, boots scraping lightly over gravel. Each step measured, each movement careful. Months of captivity had taught them a strange discipline. Not the discipline of soldiers, but the discipline of people who had learned to watch everything before trusting anything. The mess hall door opened with a slow creak, and warm air rolled out carrying a smell none of them expected. It was sweet. Not the thin sweetness of rationed sugar, but something richer, buttery, almost comforting. Inside, long wooden tables stretched beneath hanging lights, and trays had already been set out in rows. Greta noticed the silence first. Usually there was the clatter of utensils, the low murmur of guards, the restless shifting of tired prisoners. But this morning the German women stopped almost at once. Something on the trays had frozen the entire line. On each metal plate sat 3 round cakes, golden and soft, steam rising faintly from their surface. A square of butter rested on top of the stack, slowly melting into the warm layers, while a small tin cup beside the plate held amber syrup that caught the morning light like liquid honey. Greta stared at it. The pancakes looked almost unreal, too perfect, too warm, too normal. Around her the other women exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. One of them whispered in German under her breath, asking if anyone recognized the food. No one answered. Greta had been a nurse before the war, had swallowed everything she knew. She had worked long nights in field hospitals where meals came from dented tins and tasted mostly of salt and fatigue. But this was different. This looked like food made in a kitchen where no bombs had fallen and no sirens had ever screamed through the night. That was exactly what made it dangerous. Greta stepped closer to the table and studied the pancakes as if they might reveal something if she looked long enough. The butter was already softening, sliding slowly down the sides. The syrup smelled faintly of maple. The warmth coming off the plate felt almost wrong in her hands. "Don't eat yet," someone whispered behind her. It could be something else. Greta didn't answer. She was thinking the same thing. The propaganda they had grown up with had painted America in harsh colors. Loud, careless, cruel to prisoners, eager to humiliate enemies. Kindness had never been part of the story. So why would a prison camp serve something like this for breakfast? Across the room, a young American guard leaned against the wall near the serving counter. His name tag read Samuel Reed. He looked barely older than 20, his uniform sleeves rolled up, his expression calm but curious. He had already noticed the stillness spreading through the German table. Dozens of plates sat untouched while the pancakes cooled. Samuel followed their gaze down to the food and then back to the prisoners, slowly beginning to understand that something far larger than breakfast was unfolding in that quiet room. Greta reached for the fork on her tray, but stopped just short of lifting it. Her hand hovered above the plate, as if crossing an invisible line. The mess hall had gone so silent that even the small drip of syrup sliding across the metal tray sounded loud. She could feel every pair of eyes around the table waiting for someone else to move first. And Greta realized something in that moment that surprised even her. She was not afraid of the food. She was afraid of what it might mean if it was given honestly. Because if the pancakes were exactly what they appeared to be, just breakfast, then everything she had been told about this country might already be falling apart. Greta kept her hand suspended above the fork for several seconds longer than she realized. The warmth rising from the plate drifted across her fingers, soft and steady, carrying the smell of melted butter and something faintly sweet. Around her the other German women had not moved either. Some stared down at their trays with the cautious stillness of people who had learned that surprises during wartime rarely came without consequences. Others glanced quietly toward the doors, as if expecting someone to step in and explain the situation or correct a mistake that had not yet been noticed. Greta slowly lowered her hand back to the edge of the table without touching the food. The chair legs across the room scraped softly against the wooden floor as a few American soldiers finished their own breakfast and carried trays toward the wash station, but the section of the mess hall where the German prisoners sat remained frozen in place. Private Samuel Reed noticed the silence spreading across the room like a thin fog. At first he assumed the women were simply tired. Many prisoners needed time to adjust to new routines, and breakfast was usually the quietest meal of the day. But as he watched the row of untouched trays, he realized the quiet was not ordinary. The pancakes had gone completely untouched. He stepped a little closer to the serving counter, leaning forward just enough to see the table more clearly. One of the women whispered something in German, her voice low and careful. Another woman shook her head almost immediately. Greta could hear fragments of the conversation around her. Someone suggested that the syrup might be some kind of medicine. Someone else suggested the food might simply be unfamiliar American cooking. None of the explanations settled the uneasiness in the air. Greta studied the pancakes again. The edges were slightly crisp where the batter had met the hot pan. The center looked soft enough that the fork would sink through it easily. A small square of butter had already melted halfway down the side of the stack, leaving a glossy trail across the top cake. She could see the steam rising slowly, thin and pale in the morning light that filtered through the mess hall windows. Nothing about it looked threatening. That was the problem. War had trained people to expect harshness. Rations were usually plain, measured, predictable. But this breakfast felt different. Someone had taken time to make it. Someone had stood over a stove, mixing batter, turning each cake by hand, adding butter and syrup with quiet attention. It was the kind of meal Greta remembered from years before the war, from mornings in her parents' kitchen when the world had still felt ordinary. She felt a strange tightening in her chest at the thought. Across the room, Samuel Reed followed the direction of their gaze and finally looked down at the trays himself. The realization came slowly, and when it did, he almost laughed, though he caught himself before the sound escaped. To him, the pancakes were the most normal thing in the world. To them, he now understood, the pancakes looked like a question they did not know how to answer. Samuel glanced toward the kitchen door where the morning cook was finishing the last stack on the stove. Ruth Carter had been running the camp kitchen for nearly a year. She believed strongly that breakfast should always start the day properly, no matter who was sitting at the tables. Samuel stepped closer to her and nodded quietly toward the prisoner's side of the room. Ruth followed his glance and paused for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter. She looked at the untouched trays, then back at Samuel. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The meaning was already clear. Greta felt the weight of waiting growing heavier by the second. She could sense the tension around the table building in the same way a storm sometimes gathered slowly on the horizon. Finally, she reached for the fork again, this time lifting it halfway from the tray before stopping once more. The metal caught the light, trembling slightly between her fingers. She knew that if she took the first bite, the others would follow. But she also knew that the first step across an unknown line was always the hardest one to take. The fork trembled slightly in Greta Hoffman's hand, not because it was heavy, but because every pair of eyes at the table was now quietly watching her. She could feel their attention without looking up. The room had settled into a strange stillness where even the distant clatter of dishes from the wash station seemed far away. Outside the tall mess hall windows, the morning sun had climbed higher, casting long pale rectangles of light across the wooden floor. Dust drifted slowly through those beams like tiny floating threads, moving so gently that time itself felt slower inside the room. Greta lowered the fork again, letting the metal rest beside the plate. Her hesitation had stretched long enough that the pancakes were no longer steaming as strongly as before. The butter had melted almost completely now, disappearing into the layers of the cake until the top looked smooth and glossy. The syrup in the small tin cup reflected the light like polished amber. She leaned slightly closer to the tray, studying the details the way she once studied patients in the hospital wards back home. The smell was unmistakably warm and simple. Flour, butter, a hint of sweetness. Nothing sharp, nothing chemical, just food. Yet the uncertainty remained. War had taught people to question even ordinary things. Across the room, Ruth Carter stepped out from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands slowly on a white cloth. She had been watching the prisoners for several minutes. Ruth had grown up on a small farm in Missouri where breakfast was always the largest meal of the day. Her father used to say that pancakes could make even the coldest morning feel manageable. She did not think of the food she served as anything special. To her, it was simply how a morning should begin. But as she looked across the room now, she saw something she had not expected. The German women were not refusing the food out of disrespect. They were afraid of it. Ruth walked calmly toward the long table without raising her voice or calling attention to herself. The sound of her shoes against the wooden floor was steady and unhurried. Greta noticed her approach out of the corner of her eye and straightened slightly in her chair. Several of the other women fell silent immediately. Ruth stopped beside the table and looked down at one of the untouched trays. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved from the pancakes to the faces around the table, taking in the tension that had settled over the group like a thin, invisible curtain. Then she reached forward, picked up the fork from the tray in front of Greta, and cut a small piece from the top pancake. The sound was soft but clear as the fork slid through the warm cake. Ruth dipped the piece lightly into the syrup and lifted it. She ate it without ceremony, chewing slowly as if she were standing in her own kitchen rather than the center of a silent prison mess hall. When she finished, she set the fork back down on the tray and looked gently around the table. "It is just breakfast," she said quietly. The words were simple, spoken with the easy confidence of someone stating a fact that required no explanation. Greta felt something shift inside her chest when she heard the tone in the woman's voice. There was no mockery in it, no challenge, just calm certainty. Ruth stepped back from the table and returned toward the kitchen door as quietly as she had arrived. The room remained silent for several seconds after she left. Greta looked down again at the pancakes. The fork was still lying where Ruth had placed it. A faint line cut through the top cake where the small piece had been taken. Greta slowly picked up the fork again. This time she did not stop halfway. She cut a piece from the same place Ruth had cut moments earlier, lifted it carefully, and brought it toward her mouth. The cake was warm but not hot now, soft enough that it bent slightly against the fork. When Greta finally tasted it, she did not react immediately. She simply sat there, the flavors settling slowly across her tongue. It was gentle, light. The sweetness was subtle, balanced by the rich warmth of butter. She closed her eyes for a brief second as the realization settled quietly into her thoughts. This was not a trick. It was exactly what the woman had said. Just breakfast. Greta did not speak after the first bite. She simply sat there with the fork still in her hand, the taste lingering longer than she expected. Around her the room remained quiet, but the silence had changed. A moment earlier it had been tense and guarded. Now it felt uncertain in a different way, as if everyone at the table was waiting for the same question to be answered without words. Greta lowered the fork slowly and looked down at the plate again. The pancakes were no longer an unfamiliar object. They were simply food, warm, soft, and ordinary in a way that almost felt unsettling. She took another bite, this time without hesitation. The butter had soaked deeper into the layers now, and the syrup added a sweetness that reminded her faintly of something from long before the war. A kitchen window, morning light, the smell of flour and sugar in a quiet house where no one was rushing anywhere. She had not thought about that memory in years. Across the table, one of the younger women leaned forward cautiously. She had been watching Greta with careful attention, studying every reaction. In the same way people once studied weather signs before stepping outside. "Is it?" The woman began quietly in German, then stopped before finishing the question. Greta nodded once. The movement was small but clear. That was enough. Forks lifted slowly from trays across the table. At first the bites were careful and measured, as if each woman expected something unexpected to happen after the first taste. But nothing happened. The pancakes remained exactly what they appeared to be. Warm batter, butter, syrup. Simple food prepared for breakfast. Within a few minutes the sound of forks touching plates replaced the earlier silence. It was not loud. It was almost cautious, as if the women still felt uncertain about enjoying the meal too openly. But the tension that had held the table frozen only moments before was beginning to loosen. Greta noticed something else then. The room around them had returned to its normal rhythm. American soldiers carried trays past their table without staring. Someone near the coffee station laughed softly at a quiet joke. The morning routine of the camp continued as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That detail unsettled Greta even more than the pancakes themselves. If this breakfast meant nothing special to the people who served it, then it was simply part of their ordinary day. And that meant the difference between the world she had known and the world she now sat inside might be larger than she had realized. At the far side of the room, Samuel Reed remained near the wall, pretending to review a clipboard while his eyes occasionally drifted toward the table of German prisoners. He had noticed the exact moment Greta took the first bite. He had seen the others follow. The tension that had filled the room earlier had faded so gradually that most people might not have noticed it disappear. But Samuel had. He understood that the change had not come from the food alone. It had come from the moment someone showed them there was nothing hidden behind it. Greta finished the second pancake more quickly than the first. Hunger, which she had been holding back all morning, began to return with surprising force now that the uncertainty had lifted. Across the table, one of the women gave a quiet laugh of disbelief after tasting the syrup for the first time. Another shook her head slowly as if she still could not quite accept what she was eating. Greta listened to those small reactions and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. The war had taught her to expect hostility, control, and suspicion. But this morning had begun with something else entirely. A stack of pancakes, a stranger calmly taking the first bite, and a realization she could not easily ignore. Sometimes the smallest moment carried the largest question. If breakfast could be this simple here, then perhaps the world outside the story she had been told was far more complicated than she had ever been allowed to believe. Greta noticed the change first in the way the room sounded. A few minutes earlier, every movement had carried tension, as if the air itself were waiting for something to go wrong. Now the sounds had softened. Forks touched plates without hesitation. Someone at the far end of the table asked quietly for the syrup tin to be passed. Another woman, still uncertain, tasted only a small piece and then looked down at the plate with quiet surprise before taking another bite. The pancakes were disappearing slowly but steadily. Greta finished the last piece on her plate and set the fork down beside the tray. The warmth of the food settled in her stomach in a way that felt unfamiliar after months of plain rations and careful portions. It was not only the taste that stayed with her. It was the feeling of being served something prepared with attention rather than calculation. Across the mess hall, the morning routine continued. Soldiers carried trays to the wash counter. Chairs shifted across the floor, and the large coffee pot near the kitchen door released a thin curl of steam that drifted upward into the yellow light of the hanging lamps. Nothing in the room suggested that the breakfast had been intended as a gesture or an experiment. It was simply part of the day. That detail continued to puzzle Greta. She had expected captivity to be rigid and cold, defined entirely by orders and watchful distance. Yet this moment had unfolded with the calm rhythm of an ordinary morning somewhere far outside the reach of war. At the table beside her, one of the younger prisoners leaned back slightly and exhaled a quiet breath she seemed to have been holding for several minutes. Another woman wiped a small drop of syrup from her sleeve and gave a soft laugh that carried more disbelief than amusement. Greta watched these small reactions carefully. Each one felt like a piece of a puzzle shifting into a new position. She realized then that the room no longer felt like a place where everyone waited for the next command. It felt more like a kitchen where people had simply come to eat. Private Samuel Reed noticed the change as well. From his place near the wall, he could see that the table of German women had begun to relax in small but unmistakable ways. Shoulders lowered. Voices returned in quiet conversation. One woman even asked another how to pronounce the English word written on a small sign near the syrup container. Samuel did not interrupt. He understood that the moment belonged to them. The shift had not come from anything he said or did. It had come from a simple action that required no explanation. Greta stood slowly and carried her tray toward the wash counter with the others. As she walked across the room, she passed the kitchen doorway where Ruth Carter was stacking clean plates beside the stove. The older woman looked up for a moment and met Greta's eyes. There was no smile meant to impress, no speech waiting behind the glance. Only a calm acknowledgment, as if the morning had unfolded exactly the way it should. Greta hesitated briefly, then inclined her head in a small gesture of thanks before continuing toward the counter. Outside the windows, the sun had risen higher now, spreading warm light across the open yard beyond the mess hall. The day ahead would look much like the days before it. Work details, routine inspections, long hours measured by the steady movement of shadows across the ground. Yet something inside Greta had shifted during that breakfast. It was a small change, almost quiet enough to ignore. But she could not dismiss the thought that followed her as she stepped back into the morning air. If a single plate of pancakes could challenge the certainty she had carried for years, then perhaps the story she believed about this place had never been complete to begin with. The morning air outside the mess hall felt different from the air inside. Greta stepped down from the wooden porch and paused for a moment as the sunlight touched her face. It was warmer now, the pale gold of early daylight spreading across the wide yard and the rows of barracks beyond. A light breeze carried the smell of pine trees from somewhere past the fence line, mixing with the faint scent of coffee drifting out through the mess hall door behind her. Around her, the other German women moved slowly toward their assigned paths for the day, some speaking quietly, others walking in thoughtful silence. No one mentioned the pancakes directly, yet the memory of the breakfast seemed to travel with them like a quiet companion. Greta walked beside the gravel path that curved toward the work sheds, listening to the small sounds of the camp waking fully into the day. A truck engine started somewhere near the supply building. Metal tools clinked together as a maintenance crew opened a storage crate. The rhythm of ordinary work filled the air, steady and practical. Yet Greta felt as if something inside her had shifted slightly off its usual place, like a compass needle that had been nudged just enough to point in a new direction. She had spent months inside this camp measuring everything carefully. Every word spoken by a guard. Every instruction. Every look exchanged across the yard. Survival required attention to small signals. But that morning had not followed the patterns she had learned to expect. A meal had appeared without suspicion. A stranger had tasted the food first without explanation. And nothing else had followed. No lecture. No humiliation. Just breakfast and the continuation of an ordinary day. Greta walked past a row of wooden posts where the gravel path met the open work area. One of the younger prisoners caught up beside her, adjusting the sleeves of her worn jacket. "I still do not understand it," the woman said quietly in German. Greta glanced at her for a moment. "Which part?" she asked. The woman hesitated. Why they would serve food like that to us? Greta considered the question as they walked. The morning sun had risen high enough now that the shadows of the barracks stretched long across the ground like dark stripes painted over the dust. In the distance, a pair of American soldiers were unloading wooden crates from the back of a small truck. Their movements were calm and unhurried. One of them laughed at something the other said, the sound carrying easily through the open air. Greta thought about the mess hall again. The pancakes had not been prepared as a statement or an announcement. They had simply been made because that was what people here ate for breakfast. That detail remained the most difficult part to accept. "Perhaps it was not meant for us specifically," Greta said after a moment. "Perhaps it was simply breakfast for everyone." The younger woman frowned slightly as she tried to understand the idea. They continued walking in silence for several steps. Greta could feel the warmth of the morning settling across the yard as the sun climbed higher. For a long time, she had imagined the world outside the war as something distant and almost impossible, like a story remembered from childhood. Yet that morning had placed a small piece of that world directly in front of her on a metal tray. Not a grand gesture. Not a speech about fairness or victory. Just pancakes, butter, and syrup served without hesitation. Greta realized then that the moment carried a quiet weight she had not fully understood while sitting at the table. The pancakes themselves were simple, but the meaning behind them was more complicated than any rumor or lesson she had been taught. If kindness could appear in a place designed for confinement, then the lines dividing enemy and stranger were not as clear as she had believed. And once that thought had entered her mind, it refused to leave. The work yard slowly filled with the steady rhythm of the morning. Greta and the other women were assigned to a long wooden table near the maintenance shed where worn uniforms and torn work gloves were sorted for repair. The task was simple and quiet, which was exactly why it had been chosen for them. Needles moved through fabric. Thread pulled tight. The sound of cloth sliding across wood blended with the distant rumble of trucks beyond the fence. For a long time no one mentioned the breakfast directly. Yet it lingered in the air between them the way a faint scent lingers in a room after the window has been opened. Greta focused on the sleeve she was stitching, guiding the needle through the thick cotton with careful movements. She had always been good with her hands. Before the war she had learned to work quickly in hospital wards where every small skill mattered. But today, her attention drifted again and again to the memory of that quiet moment in the mess hall. The warmth of the pancakes had been simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a weight that was difficult to ignore. Across the table, the younger prisoner who had spoken earlier cleared her throat softly. "Greta," she said in a low voice, "did you notice something else this morning?" Greta looked up from the fabric. "What do you mean?" The woman glanced around before continuing. "The guard. The young one. He watched us the entire time." Greta paused for a moment. She had noticed him, of course. Private Samuel Reed had not approached their table or spoken more than necessary, yet he had remained close enough to observe the quiet tension unfolding around the trays. His expression had not carried suspicion or impatience. If anything, it had looked more like curiosity. Greta returned her eyes to the sleeve she was repairing. "Yes," she said calmly. "I noticed." The younger woman hesitated before asking the question that had been forming in her mind since breakfast. "Why do you think he did not force us to eat?" Greta considered the thought carefully before answering. The needle moved once more through the cloth, drawing a clean line of stitches along the torn seam. "Because he did not need to," she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Around the yard the morning continued with the steady rhythm of routine. An American mechanic wiped his hands on a rag beside the open hood of a truck. Two soldiers carried wooden crates across the gravel toward the supply shed. Their movements were efficient but unhurried, as if the day belonged to work rather than tension. Greta studied the scene for a moment before lowering her gaze again to the table. "If someone believes they are right," she added softly, "they rarely feel the need to prove it loudly." The younger woman frowned slightly as she tried to understand the meaning behind the comment. Greta did not elaborate. Some realizations required time to settle. As the hours passed, the sunlight grew stronger, turning the dust in the yard pale and bright. The stitching work continued, each repaired sleeve placed carefully into a growing stack on the far side of the table. Greta worked steadily now, her hands moving with practiced calm. Yet the quiet shift inside her. Thoughts continued to unfold. The pancakes had not changed the fact that she was still a prisoner. The fences still stood. The routines remained. But something subtle had entered the space between expectation and reality. A moment earlier she had believed she understood the boundaries of this place. Now she was no longer certain those boundaries were as simple as they appeared. And that uncertainty, she realized, was far more powerful than the certainty she had carried before. The sun climbed slowly toward noon, turning the work yard brighter and warmer with each passing hour. Greta continued stitching uniforms at the wooden table, the steady motion of needle and thread creating a quiet rhythm that matched the pace of the camp. Dust drifted lazily through the air, glowing in the sunlight like faint threads suspended above the ground. The distant hum of trucks and the occasional clatter of tools blended into a steady background sound that made the entire place feel strangely calm. For most of the morning, Greta worked without speaking. Her hands moved automatically, guiding the needle through worn fabric, tying knots, smoothing creases. Yet her thoughts continued returning to the same moment again and again. The pancakes had been simple, almost too simple, but simplicity had a way of exposing truths that complicated explanations often hid. Across the yard, a small group of American soldiers carried wooden planks toward the repair shed. Among them, Greta recognized the young guard she had noticed earlier that morning. Private Samuel Reed walked beside the others with a relaxed stride, one hand balancing a plank against his shoulder. He laughed briefly at something another soldier said, then set the board down beside the stack near the shed wall. From where she sat, Greta could see his movements clearly. There was nothing rigid about the way he carried himself. No harsh authority in the way he spoke to the workers nearby. He looked more like a young man doing his daily tasks than a figure representing power inside a prison camp. The observation unsettled her slightly. War had always drawn clear lines between roles. Enemy and ally, guard and prisoner. Yet the scene unfolding in the yard blurred those lines in ways she had not expected. The younger woman beside Greta noticed her looking up. "That is him," she whispered quietly. Greta nodded once, but did not reply. Samuel Reed picked up a small clipboard from a crate and walked slowly across the yard, checking off notes as he moved between work groups. When he reached the repair table, he paused a few feet away, not close enough to interrupt the prisoners, but near enough to observe their progress. His eyes moved briefly across the stack of repaired uniforms, then toward the women working around the table. Greta felt his glance settle for a moment before shifting away again. There was no hostility in the look. If anything, it held a quiet attentiveness, as if he were studying something he had not quite understood earlier that morning. Samuel cleared his throat lightly and spoke in a calm voice. "How is the stitching going?" The question was simple, directed toward the group rather than any single person. One of the older women answered in careful English. "We are finishing the sleeves now." Samuel nodded. "That will help the supply crew." "Thank you." The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Then he marked something on the clipboard and continued walking toward the next work area. Greta watched him go without turning her head fully. The conversation had been brief, almost ordinary, yet it carried the same quiet tone she had noticed during breakfast. No pressure, no suspicion, just a straightforward acknowledgment of work being done. She lowered her eyes back to the fabric in front of her and resumed stitching. The needle moved through the cloth with steady precision. Yet the thought forming in her mind refused to fade. The pancakes had been the first crack in the wall of certainty she had built around her expectations. But moments like this one widened that crack further. A calm question. A simple thank you. Small gestures that did not match the rigid image she had once believed defined this place. Greta pulled the thread tight and set the finished sleeve onto the growing stack. The sunlight had shifted across the yard now, stretching the shadows of the barracks toward the far fence. She realized something quietly as she reached for the next piece of fabric. Sometimes the strongest changes in a person's understanding did not arrive through dramatic events. Sometimes they arrived through ordinary moments repeated until the old explanations no longer fit. And somewhere between a quiet breakfast and a brief conversation beside a work table, Greta could feel that change slowly beginning to take shape. The afternoon light settled gently across the camp as the hours moved forward, turning the pale dust of the yard into a soft golden haze. Greta continued working at the repair table, but her hands had fallen into an easy rhythm now, the needle moving through fabric almost without thought. Around her, the other women stitched sleeves, patched seams, and folded finished uniforms into careful stacks that grew slowly along the edge of the wooden table. The air carried the warm scent of sunlit wood and dry earth, mixed with the faint smell of oil drifting from the repair shed where mechanics continued their work. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic or tense. In many ways it resembled an ordinary workday anywhere in the countryside. Yet Greta could not ignore the quiet shift that had begun forming in her mind since breakfast. Earlier in the war, she had believed that every action inside a prison camp would be guided by strict calculation. Food would be measured, kindness would be strategic, and every interaction would carry a purpose connected to control. But the events of the morning refused to fit that pattern. The pancakes had not been used to demand gratitude. No speech had followed the meal. No guard had reminded them who held authority. The day had simply continued. Greta pulled a thread tight and trimmed the excess carefully with a small pair of scissors. She placed the repaired sleeve on the finished pile and looked out across the yard for a moment. Private Samuel Reed had moved farther down the line of work groups, speaking briefly with the supply crew near the storage building. His posture remained relaxed, his movements calm. He checked something on his clipboard and then handed a small box of replacement buttons to one of the workers. Greta noticed how naturally the exchange unfolded. The soldier did not stand apart from the work being done. He moved through it as though he were simply another part of the routine. The younger woman beside Greta followed her gaze. "He does not act like the guards we expected," she murmured quietly. Greta nodded slightly, but did not answer immediately. The expectation the woman referred to had been carefully built through years of stories and warnings. They had been told that the enemy would be harsh, arrogant, and eager to demonstrate superiority. Yet the man walking across the yard looked nothing like that image. Greta finally spoke in a soft voice. "Sometimes people become the opposite of the stories told about them." The younger woman considered the words while continuing her stitching. Around them, the work yard maintained its steady pace. A supply truck rolled slowly along the gravel road near the fence line, its tires crunching softly against the stones. A pair of mechanics wiped grease from their hands and leaned briefly against the hood of a truck while discussing something in low voices. In the distance, the mess hall door opened and closed as the kitchen crew prepared the evening meal. Greta realized that every part of the day was unfolding with the same quiet predictability that had surrounded the breakfast earlier that morning. The calm routine itself carried a message she had not expected. If the people running this camp truly believed in treating prisoners with basic dignity, they would not need to announce it. It would appear naturally in the way the day was organized, in the way meals were served, in the way questions were asked and answers accepted. Greta picked up another worn sleeve and threaded the needle once more. The sunlight shifted slowly across the yard as the afternoon moved closer to evening. She understood that the fences around the camp had not changed. The war had not ended. But something inside her perspective had begun to move in a direction she had not anticipated. A simple breakfast had opened a small door in her thinking. And with every quiet moment that followed, that door seemed to open a little wider. By late afternoon, the sunlight had softened, turning the sky above the camp into a pale blue that stretched wide and quiet over the open fields beyond the fence. The heat of the day began to ease, and a light breeze moved across the yard, stirring the dust and carrying the distant scent of pine from the tree line far beyond the perimeter. Greta placed another finished sleeve onto the growing stack of repaired uniforms and straightened slightly in her chair. Hours had passed in steady work, and the rhythm of stitching had settled into something almost calming. Around her, the other women continued their tasks, some speaking quietly in German, others working in thoughtful silence. The work table looked different now from the morning. The pile of damaged clothing had nearly disappeared, replaced by neat rows of repaired uniforms folded carefully along the edge of the wood. It was the kind of progress that could be measured with the eyes alone, and Greta found a small sense of satisfaction in seeing the result of their effort. Across the yard, Private Samuel Reed walked back toward the repair area with the clipboard still in his hand. The sun behind him cast a long shadow across the gravel path, stretching ahead of his steps like a dark ribbon. Greta noticed that his movements carried the same calm pace she had seen earlier in the day. Nothing about him suggested urgency or authority being displayed. He paused beside the table and glanced down at the stack of finished sleeves. "You have done a lot today," he said in a steady voice. The comment was simple, spoken with the tone someone might use when acknowledging ordinary work. Greta looked up briefly, meeting his eyes for the first time since the morning. "There were many repairs," she replied carefully in English. Samuel nodded, turning a few of the folded uniforms to inspect the stitching. "The supply team will appreciate it," he said. His words carried no hidden meaning. They were simply an observation. He made a note on the clipboard and then looked across the table once more. "Dinner will be served soon," he added. "You can finish the last pieces and then head to the mess hall." Greta inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Samuel offered a brief nod in return and stepped away toward the next group of workers. The exchange lasted less than half a minute, yet Greta noticed the quiet reactions around the table after he left. One of the women exhaled softly as if she had been holding her breath during the conversation. Another gave a faint shake of her head in mild disbelief. Greta understood the reason without asking. The interaction had been so ordinary that it felt unfamiliar. Guards were expected to command, not to speak in calm, practical tones about repaired clothing and dinner schedules. She threaded the needle once more and finished the final sleeve that remained in front of her. When the last knot was tied, she placed the garment onto the stack and brushed a few loose threads from the table. The sun had begun to sink lower now, stretching long shadows from the barracks across the yard. Workers in the repair shed were closing toolboxes and wiping grease from their hands as the day came to an end. Greta stood slowly and looked toward the mess hall building where the kitchen lights had already begun to glow softly through the windows. Somewhere inside, another meal was being prepared with the same quiet certainty that had shaped the morning. She realized then that the day had passed without a single moment matching the harsh expectations she had carried into the camp weeks earlier. The fences still surrounded them, and the war remained far from finished. Yet the small events of the day had woven together into something unexpected. A breakfast served without suspicion, work acknowledged without pressure, a simple reminder that dinner would soon be ready. Greta stepped away from the repair table and began walking toward the mess hall with the others. As the evening air cooled around the yard, she understood that the pancakes had been only the beginning of a question that continued to unfold. And as the lights in the mess hall grew brighter against the falling dusk, she wondered quietly what the next answer might reveal. The evening air cooled quickly as the sun slipped lower behind the distant line of trees beyond the camp. Greta walked with the other women toward the mess hall, their footsteps quiet against the gravel path as the soft glow of yellow light began spilling through the windows ahead. The building looked almost welcoming in the fading daylight, the warm illumination inside contrasting gently with the deepening blue of the sky above the yard. For a moment, Greta slowed her steps and looked at the scene around her. Workers from the repair shed were heading in the same direction, wiping their hands on rags or brushing dust from their uniforms. A few soldiers spoke quietly near the supply building, their voices calm and unhurried. Nothing about the moment carried the tension she once expected from every interaction inside a prison camp. It felt instead like the closing of a normal workday somewhere far removed from the chaos of war. Greta stepped onto the wooden porch outside the mess hall and paused briefly before entering. The smell of food drifted through the open doorway, warm and familiar in a way that stirred the memory of that morning's breakfast. Inside, the room was brighter than it had been at dawn. The hanging lamps cast steady circles of light across the long tables, and the quiet movement of the kitchen staff behind the counter suggested that the evening meal had already begun to be served. Greta took her tray and moved slowly along the serving line. Ruth Carter stood behind the counter again, her sleeves rolled up just as they had been that morning. She placed food onto the trays with calm efficiency, greeting each person with the same brief nod of acknowledgment. When Greta reached the counter, their eyes met for a moment. Ruth did not say anything. She simply added the final portion to the tray and gave a small motion of her hand that indicated the next person could step forward. Greta carried the tray toward the same table where she had sat earlier that day. The room around her filled gradually with the low sound of conversation and the soft clink of utensils against plates. The women who joined her table looked more relaxed now than they had that morning. One of them even smiled faintly as she took her seat, though the expression faded quickly when she realized she had done it. Greta noticed the change immediately. It was small, but it was real. Across the room, Private Samuel Reed stood near the entrance with the same clipboard tucked under his arm. He spoke briefly with another soldier and then glanced across the tables as the prisoners settled into their seats. His gaze passed over Greta's table for a moment before moving on. The look carried no pressure, only quiet observation. Greta began eating slowly, listening to the room as the evening unfolded around her. The sounds were familiar now. Chairs shifting, a spoon tapping lightly against a cup, someone laughing softly at a remark too quiet for her to hear clearly. She realized that the same calm atmosphere that had surprised her in the morning had returned once again. This place, which she had expected to feel harsh and rigid every hour of the day, seemed instead to operate on a steady rhythm that allowed small moments of ordinary life to exist inside the boundaries of war. Greta set her fork down for a moment and looked across the table at the other women. They were eating without hesitation now, their movements relaxed compared to the tension she had seen earlier that day. The transformation had happened quietly, almost unnoticed. Yet it carried a meaning that Greta could not ignore. A single breakfast had been enough to begin changing the way they saw this place. And as the warm light of the mess hall settled over the room and the evening meal continued without interruption, Greta understood that the question first raised by a simple plate of pancakes was still unfolding. The answer was not arriving all at once. Instead, it was appearing piece by piece, hidden inside ordinary moments that slowly reshaped everything she thought she understood. The evening meal continued quietly under the steady glow of the lamps as the sky outside darkened into a deep blue. Greta remained seated at the long wooden table, her tray nearly empty now, listening to the low murmur of voices that moved gently across the room. The mess hall felt warmer at night than it had in the morning. Perhaps it was the lamps, or perhaps it was the way the day had slowly unfolded without the tension she had once expected from every hour inside the camp. The women at her table spoke more freely now, their voices still soft but no longer edged with the same caution that had surrounded the breakfast earlier. One of them described the repair work they had finished in the yard. Another mentioned the scent of pine that drifted through the air in the afternoon breeze. The conversation was simple, almost ordinary, yet Greta understood that even this quiet exchange represented a change. Earlier that morning, uncertainty had filled every moment. Now the room carried a different feeling. The uncertainty had not disappeared completely, but it had softened. Across the mess hall, the kitchen staff moved between the counters, clearing trays and preparing the final portions for the late arrivals. Ruth Carter worked with the same steady calm she had shown since dawn. Greta watched her for a moment and thought again about the quiet confidence with which the woman had tasted the pancakes earlier that morning. The gesture had lasted only seconds, yet it had altered the direction of the entire day. Greta realized that the action had not been meant to impress anyone. It had simply been the most direct way to remove fear from the room. On the far side of the hall, Private Samuel Reed stood near the entrance once more, speaking briefly with another guard before checking a note on his clipboard. The steady rhythm of his movements matched the rest of the evening. Nothing hurried, nothing forced. Greta noticed that several of the women at her table now ate, without watching the guards at all. Their attention had shifted naturally to their meals and their quiet conversation. It was a small detail, but one that carried meaning. Earlier that day, every glance had been cautious, every movement measured against the possibility of conflict. Now the guards had become simply part of the room, like the tables and lamps and the quiet sound of plates being cleared away. Greta rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table and looked around the hall once more. She had expected captivity to strip away every trace of ordinary life. Instead, she was discovering that small pieces of that life could still appear in unexpected places. A warm breakfast, a calm conversation beside a work table, a simple evening meal shared under steady light. None of these moments erased the reality of the war beyond the fences. Yet together they formed a pattern that contradicted the harsh picture she had once believed defined the entire experience. Greta stood slowly and carried her tray toward the wash counter, joining the line of people who moved quietly through the final routine of the evening meal. When she stepped outside, a cool breeze brushed across the yard, carrying the faint sound of crickets beginning their night song in the grass beyond the fence. The barracks stood in neat rows under the darkening sky, their windows glowing softly with lamplight. Greta paused for a moment on the wooden porch and looked out across the quiet camp. The same fences surrounded them. The same rules remained. But inside those boundaries, the day had revealed something she had not expected to find. Not dramatic kindness. Not grand gestures. Only a steady pattern of small actions that treated prisoners as people first. Greta stepped down from the porch and walked slowly toward the barracks with the others, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots. As the night settled fully across the camp, she understood that the question raised that morning had not yet finished shaping her thoughts. The answer was still unfolding, carried quietly within the ordinary rhythm of each passing day. The night settled quietly over the camp as Greta walked with the others toward the barracks. The gravel path pale beneath the soft glow of the lamps mounted along the buildings. The air had grown cooler now, and the gentle sound of crickets drifted across the open yard from the dark grass beyond the fence. Overhead, the sky stretched wide and clear, scattered with stars that seemed brighter than any she remembered seeing in the cities of Europe before the war. For a moment, Greta slowed her steps and looked upward, letting the stillness of the evening settle around her. The camp was no longer filled with the sounds of trucks or tools. Most of the day's work had ended, and the quiet rhythm of night had begun to take its place. Inside the barracks, a few of the women had already begun preparing for sleep, folding blankets or sitting on the edges of their bunks in quiet conversation. Greta stepped through the doorway and paused briefly, her eyes adjusting to the softer lamplight inside. The room carried the faint scent of wood and fabric, mixed with the cool air drifting in from the small windows along the wall. She moved toward her bunk and sat down slowly, resting her hands in her lap as the events of the day returned to her thoughts. It had begun with uncertainty, with a simple tray placed in front of her and a room full of silent hesitation. In that moment, the pancakes had looked almost suspicious, too warm and ordinary to belong inside the strict boundaries of a prison camp. Yet the quiet gesture of a woman tasting the food first had changed everything that followed. Greta realized now that the moment had carried a meaning far greater than the breakfast itself. It had not been about pancakes at all. It had been about trust appearing where fear had been expected. A single action had removed the invisible barrier that had filled the room with doubt. After that, the rest of the day had unfolded in a series of equally quiet moments. Work acknowledged without pressure. Conversations that carried no hidden threat. Meals served with the same calm routine as any other place where people simply live their daily lives. None of these moments had been dramatic enough to attract attention on their own. Yet together they had reshaped the way Greta saw the place. Around her, she leaned back slightly against the wooden wall behind the bunk and listened to the low murmur of voices around the room. One of the women laughed softly at something another had said, the sound gentle and unexpected in a place that had once seemed defined entirely by caution. Greta understood then that the war had not changed overnight, and the fences outside still stood exactly where they had that morning. But something else had changed. The certainty she had carried about the people on the other side of those fences had begun to fade. In its place, something quieter had begun to grow. Understanding rarely arrived in sudden dramatic revelations. More often it appeared through small experiences repeated until the old assumptions could no longer hold their shape. Greta closed her eyes for a moment and remembered the warmth of the pancakes, the calm voice that had said it was only breakfast, and the steady rhythm of the day that followed. Those moments had not erased the war or the distance between enemies, but they had revealed something that no lesson or rumor could fully explain. Even inside the boundaries of conflict, ordinary kindness could still exist. And sometimes the smallest act of trust was enough to remind people that the lines dividing them were not as permanent as they once believed.